This is David Harvey, and you're listening to the Anti-Capitalist Chronicles, a podcast that looks at capitalism through a Marxist lens. This podcast is made possible by Democracy at Work. In the last session, I talked about what I think is a major political issue of which we ought to be very well aware, which is the path dependency which is going on in terms of the US arming Ukraine. And I made the point that this arming of Ukraine was not innocent. It was connected to a wish to degrade Russian military capacity. At the same time, as it, of course, have put a lot of money into the pockets of the military-industrial complex, and of course that contributed to employment and economic well-being throughout the U.S. economy. And I hope that some people went off and looked at the discussion between Chomsky and Elman, because this is very serious, the Pentagon Papers and all the rest of it. This is a very serious situation, and it's one that bothers me a great deal, and I hope should bother you. But this fits into a general frustration I have, and you'll have to forgive me for voicing it as bluntly as I plan to do. And there's a general frustration that there are major issues that need to be discussed. And I will raise one of these in a meeting or in a lecture and something, and nobody responds, nobody says anything. And I think to myself, well, surely there must be some discussion of these issues. And surely we should be taking them seriously, because if they go wrong, as the case would be in the nuclear possibilities lurking within the Ukrainian war, if that is the case, then surely we should at least be discussing it. And here are some of the things I covered in a recent lecture I gave in a course, where I wrote these things out and hoped that people would react in some way, but I got absolutely no reaction to any of it. And I think that there are some issues which are so large and so big that we need to sort of take care of them. I'm not saying that somehow or other people should not take notice of other issues, because yes, you take care of all issues. But if you ignore these issues, it seems to me that the whole trajectory of where we are at and where we're going is very seriously in danger. And this arises out of the fact that we live in a society which is capitalist, and the capitalist society is based upon the endless accumulation of capital, the endless search for profit. And there are stresses and cracks in this. And one of the results of this endless accumulation of capital is a rising mass of value and of productive capacity and of commodities and all the rest of it. And this rising mass seriously compromises, it seems to me, future possibilities. And that this mass, of course, includes debt encumbrancy and all the rest of it, and money supply and all the rest of it. But here is a few points of the mass which I think are worthy of consideration. If we look, for example, at this, the World Bank data on global GDP, which is not necessarily the greatest measure, but serves purpose, adjusted to constant 2011 dollars, give us 9.25 trillion in 1950. And that rose to 34.7 trillion in 1980. That is, going from 9 to 34 trillion. 63 trillion by 2000 and 94.9 trillion by 2011. That is, there was more of a tenfold increase since 1950. And that then kind of says, how can such a compounding rate of growth be sustained into the future? what's going to happen when we're talking about an economy of 200 trillion, then 400 trillion, then 800 trillion, and then, go on and go on. How can such a compounding rate of growth be sustained? Second point, the capital value of Apple, the world's largest corporation. Actually, I think Amazon's now gone past it. The world's largest corporation, it topped 3 trillion in 2021. Elon Musk's personal wealth increased from 25 billion to 150 billion during the pandemic. Now, when I was a kid, the idea was a millionaire was somebody important. Well, nobody cares about millionaires anymore. Talk about billionaires. And we'll soon be talking about trillionaires. This is just the tip of an iceberg of astonishing centralization of wealth and power in a few hands, both private and corporate. Here's what happened. The world's central bankers injected 9 trillion, 9 trillion into the economies to counteract COVID-19 and the shutdowns. Most of that 9 trillion ended up in the pockets of the ultra-rich oligarchs. The total wealth of billionaires worldwide rose by 5 trillion, expanding from 8 to 13 trillion in 12 months. The world's wealthiest 1% took 38% of all additional wealth accumulated since the mid-1990s, and the global population of billionaires rose more than 5-fold. Just 2% of the increase in wealth after the mid-1990s went to the bottom 50%. Point 3. For the last 800,000 years, the concentrations of carbon dioxide gas in the atmosphere had never been greater than 300 parts per million. Since 1960, it has risen continuously through expanding fossil fuel use to circa 430 parts per million in 2021. The result has been a strong uptick in global warming and sea level rise, with all manner of attendant climatic and biological disruptions. While the continuing rate of emissions of greenhouse gases is a serious problem, the mass of CO2 already in the atmosphere, and it only dissipates very slowly, that mass has attached to it a whole bunch of serious problems, enough to cause major disruptions over the next 3 decades without any further additions. That is, if you made no further CO2 emissions, you'd like to see the Antarctic and Greenland ice masses pretty much disappearing, even though there are no extra emissions. In other words, the emissions already up there. The mass of it is so large. Now, the mass was not that large in 1960. It was not that large, but now it's accumulated to the point where it is the problem, and it is the primary problem. So it's not sufficient to control the rate of carbon emissions. Something has to be done about the mass, which has led to all sorts of crazy ideas about geoengineering and the like. Take a fourth point. The output of plastics has grown, particularly since plastic bottles strong enough to contain carbonated drinks were introduced in 1973, at a compound rate above 8% per annum. And 80% of the cumulative output of plastic since 1950, which is some 8,000 million tons, now lies in landfills, in the oceans, or in the atmosphere as microplastic polymers produced by plastic decomposition with exposure to sunlight, with unknown health effects. Much of the world's potable water, it turns out, is now delivered in plastic containers. Fifth point. Between 2011 and 2013, China consumed 6.6 gigatonnes of cement. Now, cement is a major emitter of greenhouse gases, while the US had consumed 4.5 gigatonnes over the last 100 years. During those 2 years, China led the world in economic growth, thus saving the world from economic recession by spreading cement everywhere in a massive construction boom unparalleled in human history. Now, when I say that China consumed, 45% more cement in 2 years than the United States did in 100 years, people go, oh, wow, that's interesting, and pass on. I think this is serious stuff. It has to be addressed. Sixth point, the number of airline trips increased from 1.2 billion in 1980 to 4.6 billion in 2019, with a major increase after 2008. In other words, one of the ways in which the world got out of the recession was to increase tourism. And this was a very, very strong process until it was cut short by the pandemic in the last 3 years. Seventh point, the International Monetary Fund often complains that the surplus of liquidity is sloshing around in the world's money markets. All the data suggests there's massive amounts of money out there. The rising mass of money seeking opportunities for productive investment is harder and harder to accommodate, prompting the suspicion that much of it is going to unproductive activity like the military. Now, the point about these is all of these examples are related. The economic growth and the compounding rate of it is connected to the growth of the plastics industry, to the growth of cement production, to all of those things. And it's also connected to the growth of tourism and the intense problems that are arising out of tourism, both culturally, economically, and politically. There are anti-tourist movements in many cities now, in Venice and Barcelona and all the rest of it. And these things, however, when you cut the tourist industry, you saw what happened to cruise liners, and you saw what happened to many of the tourist destinations. The economic effects are catastrophic, and everybody wants to get tourism back to where it was before, if not expand. But how can it expand without destroying that which it's looking at? So what we're seeing is the increasing mass. And every time I mention this, people say, yeah, oh, wow, let's talk about something more important. And there are issues which are pressing. And if you go and sort of look at the press and say, what is it bothering people, you'll see a whole raft of issues. Racism, feminism, gender, sexuality, all those kinds of issues there. And they're terribly important to address. Don't think I'm diminishing them in any way. But if we do not pay attention to these questions, if we do not pay attention to the threat of a nuclear confrontation through the Iraq war, if we do not pay attention to those things, then we are actually, challenging ourselves in ways which could, in fact, lead to the effect of a nuclear winter. And living through a nuclear winter would not simply be about us sitting down and writing Frankenstein, as Mary Shelley did, but like I've said, this is a very, very, very dangerous situation. Now, one of the things that is said to me when I say this sort of thing is that, well, these problems you talk about are so big and they seem to be intractable. And my answer to that is, well, step by step, each one of the things I've mentioned is to some degree tractable. It's not impossible to start to think about the constraining of, for example, cement use and cement utilization and the sort of radical urbanization process which is going on. And it's possible to think about doing something about plastics. The fact that only about 5 or 10% of plastics can be recycled is an important datum. And there are some technologies now about trying to develop plastics which are easily recyclable. So there are things that can be done and things that can be worked at. But the trouble with all of them is that this takes international cooperation. And it's only when effective international cooperation can be constructed that you're going to get the sort of response to these things which are worth. Meanwhile, we need to sort of sit down and write some alternative possibilities look like and how they look. And I then look around and say, well, who is doing that? And are there examples of this going on right now? And to his credit, I want to say that Thomas Piketty is one of the examples that I want to look at. In his last book, which is about the question of equality, his last book is a very good example of at least beginning to think about the nature of the problems which we face. But before getting into Piketty, I want to make some comment about where he lies in the general spectrum of economic thinking. And if I had to put him in a typecast, I'd say, Piketty is writing in the tradition of what I call Ricardian Socialism. Now, Ricardian Socialism has an interesting history. And it came out of the fact that the classical political economists, with Ricardo in the forefront, of course, the classical political economists worked with the labor theory of value. They took the view that value was established by, labor and was associated with labor. And their whole economic thinking was guided by embrace of the labor theory of value. But there was a moral issue that came with the labor theory of value, which the Ricardian socialists were very much concerned with. And it was this: if labor is the source of all value, how come labor receives so very little of it and the capitalists seem to get it all? This was a bothersome moral question. And it was a moral question that was actually provoked by embrace of the labor theory of value. If you say value is labor and labor input, and you don't give the laborers anything, then there's something clearly wrong. And so a whole school of Ricardian socialists grew up, and this whole school was about trying to rectify that wrong, how to rectify it, and at the same time keep the economy running. And they started to come up with some very interesting ideas, which basically were about a redistributive socialism. That is, what they saw was production was generating the what was needed. That production was organized in a certain way, and they started to say, well, we can't do too much about production. But once the commodity is produced, we can do something about its distribution. And therefore, we have to redistribute the value which is produced so that some of it, more and more of it, goes somehow or other to labor and to those who produce the value. And this culminated in John Stuart Mill's text on socialism, which came out about mid-century, which is a wholesale embrace of this. So this Ricardian school of socialists was really trying to say, all right, capital is organizing production. We're not going to mess with that. But we can change the way in which the product is distributed, and it's through distributive measures, which is, of course, largely the philosophy of social democratic parties, that what we try to do is to redistribute the wealth in certain ways towards the needy populations and to those who are, of course, doing the work. So Piketty is very much in that line of Ricardian socialists. But that, therefore, involves some pretty macro thinking. And that macro thinking is something which is worthy of consideration. Having said that, I must immediately suggest, of course, that Marx was fiercely critical of the Ricardian socialists. And he was fiercely critical because, in his view, the problem lay not in distribution, but in production. Who had the power to organize production, and who had the power to change, as it were, the economy in foundational ways? And Marx was kind of saying, John Stuart Mill thinks that socialism is about simply redistribution, when actually he says that we cannot interfere with the act of production, and production is a fact of nature. In fact, this is what Mill says. He says, production is a fact of nature, and we can't change nature, but we can change the distribution. So that was his philosophical standpoint. And Marx hates that and says, no, I don't want anything to do with that. We'll come back to this kind of positionality of Marx later on. But for the moment, let's stick with Ricardian socialism as an interesting philosophical standpoint. Now, before I get to that, I want to make some comment about the theory of value. as probably most of you know, the theory of value fell into disfavor from about 1850 onwards. So that by the time you get to the end of the 19th century, no respectable economist will be, held to the labor theory of value. They dismissed it as kind of basically nonsense, subjective, not scientific, and all that kind of thing. So there was a mockery of the labor theory of value. By the time you get to 1900 or so, that the labor theory of value is nothing. But notice something. What replaced the theory of value? What replaced it was a marginalist theory of value, in which production was taken to be the outcome of the fusion of three basic factors of production: land, labor, and capital. And the remuneration of those factors of production, land, labor, and capital, depended on their scarcity, their relative scarcity. So you would end up with a situation which, if labor was very plentiful, then obviously its reward would not be very great. If capital was very scarce, then obviously capital should get a high rate of remuneration. So the relative scarcity of those factors of production led to the idea that each one of them received its just price in terms of its relative contribution to the value of the product. That is, labor did not communicate very much value to the product because it was relatively abundant. Capital did, so therefore, Now notice this. The moral question which Ricardian Socialists faced, which was why, if labor produced all the value, it receives so very little of it, that is wiped out. It disappears. The moral question disappears. And therefore, it became a technical science. It became a positivist science. Economics became and the marginal availability and contribution of the different factors of production was what determined their price, and that it was a just price because of. Now, look at that for a moment. What is it that fixes the relative scarcity of labor? Marx's point on this is very interesting. In Capital, he says the thing about labor as a commodity is that capital actually fixes both the demand and the supply. How does it fix the supply? Well, it engages labor-saving innovations. It throws people out of work. It creates what Marx called an industrial reserve army. So capital creates a situation in which labor will always be scarce, or always be plentiful. There will always be an adequate industrial reserve army. When it's not throwing people out of work, it's going and pulling in people from peasant societies and Chinese peasantry and all the rest of it into production. So labor is always going to be super abundant as far as capital is concerned, and capital has the means to ensure that it remains super abundant. Therefore, wages are always going to be low relative to the payment which is made to capital, which is capital is relatively scarce, or at least was relatively scarce. But the trouble with that argument is that capital has now become relatively abundant. The IMF, in its various reports over the last few years, is constantly going back to the fact that there's a surplus of liquidity sloshing around in the markets. Where can that surplus liquidity be accommodated? Where can it find a productive use? And as I've often argued, the result of this is that a lot of capital is now deliberately put into non-productive activities, one of which, of course, is military expenditures. So, great. The capacity of surplus capital is now being absorbed by, the military-industrial complex. And if you can set up something that can make things that blow apart Russian tanks, then you're going to be lent money to do it. So it's interesting that the theory of value, which at one time, back in the first part of the 19th century, posed a moral question about distribution. The theory of value that did that is discarded for a theory of value that does not pose that moral question, and that presumes that everything is done according to these abstract laws of accumulation of capital an abstract application of value, and that the theory of value is objective and real and that. But now there are all kinds of reasons why I would want to challenge the objectivity and reality of that, and particularly in terms of exactly how do you value what capital is and what is capital. But I won't get into that. But Piketty then is really harking back. He's not that he's gone back to the labor theory of value or anything of that kind, but the sensibility of Piketty is very much dominated by this question of how to redistribute the value that is produced. And on this, he has some very interesting proposals. One of which is to say that equality in society is a certain measure of equality in society is a virtuous thing. There's a tendency to believe that an unequal society drives growth. The evidence for that historically is not there. The more equal the society, the better the equality of education and all that kind of thing, the stronger is the growth. And the more adaptable is the labor force, and the more flexible and resilient the economy becomes. There's a lot of evidence for that. And that evidence is so that he needs then to look very much at the nature of equality in present society. And he differentiates here between equality of incomes and equality of wealth. And he decides that the equality of wealth is the real problem. And I certainly am inclined to agree with him on that. The equality of incomes is serious, but the equality of wealth is really, really serious. And the inequalities are striking. And he makes the point here that 50% of the population in the United States and in Europe holds about 2 to 4% of the wealth. In the United States, it's 2%. In Europe, it's 4%. But 50% of the population has only 2 or 4% of the wealth. When you go to the other end, the other 50%, it's divided into two. The top 10% gets about 60% of the wealth, leaving 40% for the remaining 40% in the population. Now, Piketty points out something that is very interesting. The long run, which is talking about over 200 years, there has been a greater level of equality. This is a surprising statement, given the levels of inequality that now are prevailing. But his point is that if you look at the data back in the mid-19th century when Marx was writing, it was actually the whole of the 90% of the population held only about 2 or 4% of the wealth. And all of the wealth was really concentrated in the top 10%. What we've seen over the last century or so, and century and a half or so, has been actually the growth of a middle class. That is the growth of a 40% of the population that holds about 30 or 40% of the wealth. I'm in that class, if you want to put it that way. I have a comfortable wealth situation, and the result is that the kind of wealth I have can be passed on to the next generation. So my children can expect a legacy of some kind, provided it's not taken in sort of old age care or something like that. But they can expect a legacy of wealth which will come to them. The bottom 50%, there's no legacy of wealth. They're not able to accumulate wealth, even though they have the incomes. The incomes they have are only sufficient to earn their living and pay their basic rent and food and all the rest of it. So the bottom 50% is stuck in 2% of the wealth forevermore, and will not be able to do anything about it. And Piketty's point is that is a negative situation that needs to be addressed. Partly, he says, for moral reasons, obviously, and that's the Ricardian argument coming out, but also, in his view, because the economy will be much more stable and much more dynamic if the talents and the possibilities in within that 50% of the population that currently is kind of working like crazy just to have enough food and on the table, that population will be needs to be liberated. And then the question is, how can that be liberated? And he looks therefore at wealth transfer. Now we know what happens to the children of the Rockefellers or the Buffetts or so on. They're going to end up with huge legacies, and they have no problem for the rest of their lives. The 40%, which I'm part of, the legacies passed on are moderate and moderate. They're okay in some cases, depending upon how long people live, how long they work, what their health condition is, and all the rest of it. Kids from that generation, can look forward to some sort of legacy, which will be important in, for instance, retiring the mortgage on their house, or putting a down payment on a house, or et cetera, et cetera. So that 40%, but the 50% is never going to go anywhere. So Piketty kind of says, well, what we've got to do is to actually create a legacy. So we take the average legacy of the whole society, including all the very rich and including the 40%. We take the whole legacy and we say, let's redistribute that legacy, so that when somebody reaches age, say 25, and that's his proposal, his suggestion, when they reach 25, they get the legacy of the former generation. It's redistributed to them. And he calculates this would be, in the United States, would mean that at age 25, somebody would get a legacy of $300,000. Now, $300,000. It sounds a lot if you're at the bottom of the legacy, if you're at the bottom of the income and wealth pyramid, but that's nothing to Bezos or to Musk or to the billionaires. That's nothing to them. 300,000 is nothing. But Piketty says, consider what they might do with 300,000. They might, get better education. They might be able to buy get better housing. In other words, if people could look forward to this legacy, which would come to them at age 25, this would make a radical difference in how that generation operates. Because for one thing, there can be probably means by which people could purchase better education or something of that kind, where they're a bit younger and go into debt and then get the debt retired when they get the legacy. But if they could look forward to a legacy of $300,000, what would they be able to do with their lives, and how would they be able to live, and actually then how would our cities look? How would change the redistribution of income? The question of affordable housing would probably disappear, because people who are coming out, kids who are in unaffordable situations, would suddenly find themselves in a situation where they could afford something. They could invest, get an income from it, all kinds of things like that. So what they do with it is obviously going to depend very much upon their situation. But this is a major idea, a very important idea. And Piketty's point is that really what this does is it does for the bottom 50% what happened to the middle 40%. So this redistribution of income is not so bizarre that it's impossible to imagine, because it has been done historically. Over the last 200 years, there has been a significant redistribution of income, which has not imperiled the well-being of the top 1%. In fact, the top 1% is more concentrated in its wealth than it's ever been. So it's not as if that second tier, 40%, has somehow or other inhibited what is going on in the top. But what Piketty kind of says is, what we need to do is we need to begin at the very top with the excess billionaires and to look at their legacies, and to simply say to the children of the ultra billionaire rich, yeah, you're going to get a legacy too, but it's not going to be the full legacy. You're only going to get a part of the legacy. Let's suppose instead of $300,000, you get a legacy of $600,000 or $900,000. Then the rest we appropriate and we give it to the bottom 50%, and we begin to redistribution that way. And we would find even the top 40%, or the 40% that's in the top half, would see some of their legacy curbed. I mean, my legacy right now is if I remain fit and all the rest of it, given my pension fund and all the rest of it, is quite substantial. And a substantial part of that can go to my own children, but a certain portion of it would be perfectly good to take away and give away to the bottom 50%. So Piketty had come up with an idea, and he then says something which is interesting, because he says, well, if we look historically at the periods when capital was most stable and where the growth of capital was strongest, then it was periods when the top tax rate was very high. And go back, and I've mentioned this, I know, before, up until 1980 and Reagan's tax reforms, the top tax rate in the United States never went below 70%, and sometimes was even as high as 90%, as it was after the war, when there was a large debt that needed to be retired, and a lot of it came out of the top 9, the 90% tax rate on the ultra rich. So this could be set up, and Piketty's argument is that this probably would be the greatest step that could be taken. Now, so let's discuss it, and let's discuss it. Now, the second thing he does is to say, well, one of the reasons we don't have this is because the distribution of economic power right now is rather lopsided. And he points out that this, the reason the bottom 50% never got very much because the bottom 50% was always until recently excluded from the vote. And as things are going, of course, in the United States, there's continuing attempt to exclude them from the vote. They were excluded from the vote, and they were excluded from political influence by the fact that they couldn't have campaign contributions and so on. So you need to reform all of that in order to have a political situation in which the kind of legislation that would lead to these redistributions would occur. But the second thing he points out is that, yes, okay, something has to be done about the right to distribution, about control over production. And he lauds very much the German model of co-production. In the large German firms, employing more than 1,000 or 2,000 people, labor has 50% or 49% or something like that, of the seats on the board of directors. And the result of this is that corporations find it difficult, I think, to do things which are so anti-labor as to be, draconian, like of the sort that Apple is doing with its labor force, or Amazon is doing with its labor force. You just couldn't do that in Germany, because those corporations would have to have a very significant representation of labor on their executive boards. But so this was, again, something terribly important. And in fact, the very large corporations find that if they want to set up a branch plant somewhere else in the world, they have to get the agreement of the trade union organization. And this means that German corporations are far less likely to engage in offshoring for race to the bottom in terms of wage rates than other corporations. Now, the problem in Germany is this only applies to large corporations, 1,000. Piketty kind of says this should apply to all organizations more than 20. There should be co-organization. And this was something that has been looked at a little bit in this country with employment stock option plans, which are not very effective, and in fact turn out to be a way of imprisoning and gutting labor rather than liberating it and emancipating it in this country. But in Sweden, for example, the way this works is again rather like the German model. There is co-management of labor and capital, and early on there was this Meidner plan, which was going to redistribute things such a way that eventually the private owners of the corporations would disappear, and it would entirely become within the proletariat of labor being in charge. So these possibilities are there, and they're already there in nascent form. And one of the things that Piketty points out is that if you end up with this collaborative work, the corporation becomes much more cooperative and collaborational rather than confrontational. And therefore, labor relations in Germany have a better history than labor relations in many other parts of the world. The Anglo-Saxon model is not very adequate to this purpose. So again, these are issues that need to be discussed, and we don't see widespread discussion of these sorts of possibilities. And I'm grateful to Piketty that he has at least put these issues on the agenda. So we need on the left not only to deal with those issues which are very significant in terms of intersectionality and all the rest of it. We need, in addition, to start to take these sorts of issues very, very seriously, because who is in the bottom 50%? Who is in that bracket where wealth is not concentrated? Who is suffering from the lack of wealth? Well, when you look at it, you find that disproportionately, of course, people of color, women, particularly single-headed households and all the rest of it. So we've got a situation where everyone could be bettered off, no matter what their positionality and the intersectionality debate. Everybody will be better off if we will pay attention to these major macro issues. In other words, let us get our priorities rather differently. And I know this is going to sound like somehow or other, here he goes, Marx is saying, well, get the class relation right and everything's okay. No, I'm talking about practical possibilities. And Piketty, by setting out a program of what I would call Ricardian Socialism, goes partway to I think, laying the basis for a discussion of at least the role of Ricardian socialism in future possibilities, because that is where social democracy should be and where it might end up. These are the sorts of things which need to be discussed in spite of all of the immediate questions which are surrounding us. And so please, let us take some time off from the normal structures of debate and talk about these issues, because these issues are fundamental to everyone. And if there is a nuclear winter, we're all of us going to disappear. If there is a nuclear confrontation, 1 billion of us are likely to disappear. If we do not solve these kinds of problems of the bottom 50% and what to do about the bottom 50%, then everybody who is in the bottom 50% is going to continue to suffer interminably forever, and we will get endless capital accumulation, running around not knowing what to do, except that it is wallowing in producing unproductive capacity, particularly in the in the munitions industry and in the defense industries. Defense industries are doing fine right now. If you're employed in the defense, great. If you're not, then there's a problem. But these are the sorts of issues which need to be worked out on a macro basis. And don't imagine that somehow or other these are so large and so big that it's impossible to change them, because they have changed historically. That movement, which gave the middle class its positionality in contemporary society in the advanced capitalist countries, that movement, and which has now done so and is doing so in China, that movement, it seems to me, is there and has been there, and therefore we can extend it to the bottom 50%. And there are ways to do it. And all of us, I think, would then be better off, because a lot of the anomie in society, the alienation in society, a lot of the kind of the violence and the difference and so on, which we're witnessing in society, I am certain can be traced back to the fact of these foundational inequalities, which are not simply inequalities which most people would find acceptable, but are inequalities where there's a gross injustice, a gross unfairness, and the only way in which people can respond to them is by taking up arms and engaging in violent acts and so on. So we need to have that conversation. Thank you for joining me today. You've been listening to David Harvey's Anti-Capitalist Chronicles, a Democracy at Work production. A special thank you to the wonderful Patreon community for supporting this project.